Welcome to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. On Fridays, I will be posting clips from previous episodes, and the point here is just to bring you some of the highest yield topics from each podcast in order to kind of reinforce those topics. This clip is from the Social Stratification podcast and covers stereotype threat. Enjoy. And one thing I didn't mention was the concept of stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is defined as a situation in which people feel at risk of conforming to some stereotype about their social group, which in effect causes them to actually conform to the stereotype. And this is a bit of a weird concept, but I'll give you some examples and I'll actually go back to one of the original experiments that kind of showed this effect. So if you don't understand by that definition, just hold on for a sec. So one of the original studies that showed stereotype threat was done in 1995, the year I was born, and it was done by Claude Steele and Joshua Arnson. And they got the idea for this study when they noticed that African American students were not performing as well as white students on the GRE, which is the graduate exam for normal grad school. And I think a lot of schools are getting away from it now. But back then, everyone was taking it to get into graduate school. And so what they did to kind of understand why this was the case is that they took a pool of African American and white students, and they split this pool into three groups so that each group had white students and African American students. And in group one, they described the GRE as, or I think it was a section of the GRE, they described it as a diagnostic test of intellectual ability. So that's group one. Group two, they described the test as a laboratory problem-solving task that was non-diagnostic of ability. And then in group three, the test was described again as a laboratory problem-solving task that was non-diagnostic of ability. And then further, they told the students to look at it as a challenge. And in the end, all three groups received the same exact test or passage or whatever it was they're being tested upon. And what they noticed was that in groups 2 and 3, the scores of the white subjects and of the African American subjects were not statistically different, whereas the subjects in group 1 actually had statistically different scores. The white students scored higher than the African American students, with a p-value around 0.03. And what the authors of the study concluded was that stereotype threat was the reason then that the African Americans scored lower on this test in this group 1 condition. In other words, what they were saying is that these students actually internalized the stereotype that they don't perform well on standardized tests that are there to measure their ability, and therefore they scored lower on that test. So essentially they're saying that, over time these students have heard that, you don't do good at the standardized tests that measure your aptitude. And so because they have that thought in their head, then they end up actually confirming that stereotype when they take the test. And so in a way, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's been many other studies done to show the same effect. One that comes to mind is this study where they looked at the performance of women versus men on some kind of math test. And before the test was taken, they told the women, women tend to not score as high on math tests as men. In one group, in the other group, they didn't. And you saw the same effect.
School coach, we know that getting into medical school is hard. In fact, 60% of pre-meds who apply to medical school don't even get accepted. And if you want to get accepted into a top medical school, it's even harder. It's a complicated process, and even students with great grades and MCAT scores get left out. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for admissions advising. Our advisors are all physicians and former admissions committee members, so they know exactly what medical schools are looking for. One-on-one admissions advising from Med School Coach makes all the difference. Our expert team will help you develop a game plan, prepare your application, edit your essays, and coach you for interviews. Every pre-med has a story, and we'll help you tell it so you can stand out from the crowd. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach admissions advising package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.